Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to talk today about how the wars end. But first, let's just open with a brief word of prayer using this contemporary prayer by Pope Pius XII. Almighty and eternal God, may your grace enkindle in all of us a love for the many unfortunate people whom poverty and misery reduce to a condition of life unworthy of human beings. Arouse in the hearts of those who call you Father a hunger and thirst for social justice and for fraternal charity in deeds and in truth. Grant, O Lord, peace in our days, peace to souls, peace to families, peace to our country, and peace among the nations. Amen. All right, so welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about how World War II comes to an end. So in the previous lessons, we've talked about how the Germans came to dominate most of Europe in the European theater of the war. And we began to talk about how the Japanese began to take over large portions of Asia and the Pacific theater. So today we're going to return to our story of the war, both in Europe and Asia, and talk about how the war reaches its conclusion. So we'll start by talking about the actions that Japan takes in the Pacific to draw the United States into the war. And then we'll look at how the war concludes in both theaters. So we were talking about the war in Asia earlier this week, and we talked about how the Japanese sweep down across the coast of eastern China. And we had pretty much ended with the Nanjing massacre, in which the Japanese kill hundreds of thousands of Chinese. China during the interwar years is caught in the middle of a civil war between communists and nationalists. We've got the Chinese Communist Party, and we've got the KMT, the Kuomintang. However, during World War II, these two opposing factions form a united front against the Japanese. For both the communists and the nationalists, the Japanese are a major enemy. So together, collectively, they have 1.7 million soldiers by 1941. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, in particular, wins a lot of support for their work during World War II, whereas the KMT is mostly fighting with the conventional army. The CCP, the communists, are mostly engaged in guerrilla warfare and have a much closer connection to the local people because of that. And this is going to win them a lot of support when the war is over, as they continue their struggle to take over China. In 1940, the Japanese sign the Tripartite Pact with the Germans and the Italians, making Japan a part of the Axis and officially linking what has been going on in Asia to the war we've been talking about in Europe. Now that Japan is part of an Axis, the French Vichy government, the French collaborationist government led by Marshal Pétain, they give Japan their blessing to take over France's colonies in Southeast Asia. The Vichy invite the French to take over Indochina. Indochina today, we would say this is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Basically, the French say, well, you know, you're over there, you are our ally, you are free to enter and to administer Indochina. The United States is not too happy about Japan's imperialist activities in East Asia. We respond by embargoing shipments of oil to the Japanese. Japan is not really an oil-producing nation. They're heavily reliant on foreign oil for their war effort. And this leaves the Japanese in a difficult position. The Japanese know that they cannot continue the war without more oil. And so the Japanese are left with essentially two options. One, they can do what the United States wants, which is back down, end the war in Asia, and have the United States resume shipments of oil. Or two, they can declare war on the United States. They can force the United States' hand. And it is, of course, that second option which the Japanese pursue. On December 7th, 1941, as you all should be aware by now, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack on Pearl Harbor draws the United States into the Second World War. Pearl Harbor is where America's Pacific Fleet is located. And the Japanese had hoped that by attacking Pearl Harbor, they could knock out the American fleet, leaving the United States unable to carry on, or sorry, unable to prevent the Japanese from carrying on in Asia. The Japanese launched their surprise attack at 7:48 in the morning on December 7th. They attacked Pearl Harbor with 350 aircraft launched from 6 aircraft carriers. And they do major damage to both the base and to the United States fleet. All 8 American battleships are damaged. 4 of them are sunk. All of these battleships, though, except for the USS Arizona, are returned to service. 188 American planes are destroyed. 2,403 Americans are killed in the attack. Fortunately for the United States, 3 of the United States' aircraft carriers are out to sea. I should say all 3 of the United States' aircraft carriers are out at sea when the attack occurs and are not damaged. The Japanese, for their part, lose just 29 aircraft, 5 submarines, and 64 men. So it is a pretty smashing defeat for the United States. It's a big victory for the Japanese. The next day, the Japanese declare war on the United States. And I asked you to read this declaration for homework earlier this week. And I'd like you to think about what the Japanese government claims that they were doing in this war. What motivations do they give for their actions? Particularly, what do they claim that they're doing in China, and what do they see as their relationship to China? And ultimately, do you buy why they claim they have gotten into World War II? Speaking about the events at Pearl Harbor, the American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, declared famously that this will be a day that will live in infamy. And a few days later, the United States officially declares war on Japan. And a few more days after that, the Germans declare war on the United States, since Japan is, of course, in the Axis. After winning the Battle of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese began an all-out conquest of the Pacific. The Japanese took the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Midway Island, Hong Kong, Thailand, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, British Malay, the Aleutian Islands. And if we just go forward a minute, I can show you on the map. If you look at the red outline there stretching from China over to Midway Island, this is the full extent of Japanese territory during the war, conquered territory, I should say. And you can see they have swallowed up just a massive portion of the Pacific Ocean here. The Japanese, in conquering these places, are very key to portray themselves as liberators. Many of these are places that have been colonized by Western powers, by Europeans. The Japanese, when they take over these places, claim that they are liberating these Asian peoples from their European colonizers. And to that end, in 1940, the Japanese claim that they have created what they call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. That all of these places that used to be European colonies have been united into this new empire by Asians, for the greater good of everyone. In reality, of course, these places have been conquered by the Japanese. They are occupied. And although people in some of these colonies are happy to welcome the Japanese as liberators, they soon discover that the Japanese are no better, and in fact, in some cases, much worse than the Europeans who had ruled these places before. We'll wrap up our story of the war in the Pacific a little bit later in this lecture. But for now, I want to return to Europe and to 1941 there, because 1941 is a turning point, not just because it's the year that America enters the war after Pearl Harbor, it's also the year that the Russians enter the war. So we're going to cut back to Europe, and then we will return a little bit later today to what is happening in the Pacific. You may remember that Hitler and the Germans had managed to take over most of Western Europe. France has fallen, Norway has fallen, Belgium, the Netherlands have fallen. Poland is long gone. The war is looking pretty grim in Europe at this point. And having taken over most of continental Europe, Hitler now sets his sights towards the east and embarks upon Operation Barbarossa, which is his attack on the Soviet Union. Remember that in 1939, the Germans and the Russians had been on the same side. The Germans and the Russians had signed the Non-Aggression Pact, wherein they also planned their partition of Poland. And even as recently as 1940, there had been negotiations between Stalin and Hitler for Germany and the Soviet Union to continue their partnership, both as members of the Axis. However, in the summer of 1941, Hitler launches this all-out invasion of the Soviet Union. The Germans forced their way into the Soviet Union with 3.6 million soldiers, 3,700 tanks, 2,500 planes. And just as he had caught many people off guard in Western Europe, Hitler also catches Stalin off guard. So they enter Russian territory in June. By December of 1941, Hitler is getting very, very close to Moscow. Fortunately for the Russians, the Germans are met with a brutal counterattack by the Russian winter. The Russians sometimes refer to winter as General Winter because of the key role it has played in their history in helping them. And Hitler learns the same lesson that Napoleon had learned in the Napoleonic Wars, which is not to invade Russia in the winter. The Germans had not bothered to bring winter clothing, and the Russian winter was brutal. Some 100,000 German soldiers suffer from frostbite in Operation Barbarossa. It takes a while for the Russians to get their act together, but once the Russians fully mobilize, they greatly outnumber the Germans. The Germans had sent 150 divisions to Russia, and these 150 divisions were spread out across an 1,800-mile-long front line. The Russians, on the other hand, had 360 divisions waiting to meet them. On the Eastern Front, one of the big turning points for the war is the Battle of Stalingrad. Today we would say Stalingrad is Volgograd. You can see it in the corner of the map here. Here's Stalingrad. Some of these cities in Russia changed names as a result of the breakup of the Soviet Union. In any case, the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad is an industrial Russian city on the banks of the Volga River, north of the Caucasus, and about halfway between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. After the Germans had captured the Crimean Peninsula, the German generals also wanted to capture the Caucasus because of the Caucasus' rich oil fields. Hitler, however, instead ordered them to capture Stalingrad. The Germans met with fierce resistance at Stalingrad. Joseph Stalin ordered the Russians not to give up as much as an inch to the Germans. Stalin famously says, right, not a step back. The Russians had hunkered down in the burnt out factories of Stalingrad and used them like bunkers. From September to November of 1942, the battle had devolved into street-to-street fighting in the ruins of the city. Most of the city is basically destroyed in the battle. Both sides took heavy losses. And worse, in the cold Russian fall, food supplies became scarce. And both the Germans and the Russians had to reduce to things, or had been reduced rather, to things like eating horses and cats. It was very much a war of attrition. On November 8th, Hitler proclaimed to the world that the 6th German army had succeeded in taking Stalingrad, so Hitler declares victory. Hitler, unfortunately, was wrong, though. The Russians struck back, and by November 23rd, the Russians completely surrounded the Germans. And Hitler refused to let the Germans retreat. And as the winter drags on, things get worse and worse. By February of 1943, the Germans finally are forced to surrender. The Russians are able to capture the entire German Sixth Army. Originally, the Sixth Army had 300,000 soldiers. At this point, though, in February of 1943, there are only 85,000 soldiers left in the Sixth Army. And these 85,000 soldiers are taken prisoner by the Russians. And just to kind of paint a picture of how bleak this is for these captured Germans, of those men, just 6,500 will live to see the end of the war. So this is a huge defeat for the Germans. A whole massive section of Hitler's army has been taken out by the Russians in this battle that Hitler thought they had won back in November. And at this point, the Russians, under Stalin, will continue pressing further and further west and working their way towards Berlin, towards the capital. Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies are cooking up plans of their own. So Plan A was to invade Europe from the south through Italy. Italy was described as the soft underbelly of Europe. And this was seen as kind of the way in to launch an invasion of Europe. The Italian invasion was led by the American General Patton and the British General Montgomery. In May of 1943, they defeated the Axis in Tunisia, and in July, they launched an invasion of Sicily. At the same time, Mussolini is also facing increasing opposition at home from his own people. In July of 1943, they oust Mussolini from power, and they begin negotiating peace with the Allies. By September of 1943, the Italians have signed an armistice, a ceasefire with the Allies, effectively ending the war. Meanwhile, Mussolini has been imprisoned by the Italians, but the Germans, using an elite team of paratroopers, break him out of prison and set him up as the leader of an Italian puppet state in northern Italy. And seeing that the war in Italy was not, in fact, over, the Allied forces are now made to launch an invasion of mainland Italy, or forced into that. Unfortunately, despite believing that Italy was the soft underbelly of Europe, the fighting proved to be very difficult, and the Allies made slow progress. The city of Rome would not surrender until June of 1944, so the Italian plan to reach Germany and to bring the war to an end simply is not working. And so, with the Italian plan not working out, the Allies plan a new invasion route, this time not from Italy, but northwards, or rather from the north and towards France. And so this is led by the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. So the Allies launch a massive amphibious invasion of the beaches of Normandy in France, which of course we call D-Day, also known as Operation Overlord. And this takes place on June 6, 1944. So the Allies land troops at 6 beaches on the Norman coast. Some 132,000 men land on the beaches. 24,000 men parachute in. It's a massive operation. The Allies even construct massive concrete harbors, mulberries, to facilitate landing all of these men on the beaches. Once on shore, the men face massive resistance from the German army. It is a long, agonizing battle. To crib the title of the old movie, right? This is the longest day here, D-Day. The waters on the beach soon turned red from the blood of the slain soldiers. 4,414 Allied troops lose their life on D-Day. About 1,000 Germans are also killed. It is very slow going, but it is the opening that the Allies need. And you can see on the bottom of the slide there the famous photograph of one of these landing craft and the soldiers getting off of it. That photo is called Into the Jaws of Death. From D-Day onwards, it is basically a race between the Americans and the Soviets to see who can get to Berlin the fastest. the US and the British gained their foothold in Normandy, and they began a slow march toward Germany, liberating territory. As they ramp up the war, the British and the Americans in February of 1945 firebombed the city of Dresden, doing major damage. Dresden was the 7th largest city and a major industrial center. And the British and the Germans take the drastic action of bombing the city in an attempt to cripple German industry, to prevent, or rather to hurt the German army. The bombing was very successful, and you can see a photograph of the damages there to the city. But it comes at an enormous cost. Somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 people in the city are killed in the firebombing of Dresden. Ultimately, though, it's not going to be the British and the Americans who get to Berlin first. It is going to be the Soviets. The battle for Berlin is fought between April 16th and May 2nd of 1945. Similarly to Stalingrad, the battle rages street by street, and we think somewhere on the order of 100,000 people are killed. Ultimately, Hitler, realizing that defeat was imminent, commits suicide on April 30th, 1945. On May 2nd, the battle is basically over, and Soviet soldiers raise the hammer and the sickle, raise the Soviet flag there on the roof of the Reichstag that you can see in the picture. Then on May 8th, the Germans officially unconditionally surrender to the Allies. And we call May 8th, 1945 VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. So the war in Europe is over now, or at least the fighting is. There is going to be a lot of controversy about what we do with Europe now that the Germans have been defeated, how we put the pieces back together. That's a topic that we'll talk about next week when we talk about the origins of the Cold War. But for now, let's shift gears and return to the Pacific theater and see how the war concludes in the Pacific. So I apologize for playing fast and loose with dates here. We're back to 1942 now. So remember, Pearl Harbor is bombed in December of 1941, and it takes the Americans a while to regroup after their defeat at Pearl Harbor. But really, one of the key moments here after Pearl Harbor is the Battle of Midway, which takes place in June of 1942. It is one of the main turning points of the war. So the U.S. attacked the Japanese fleet at Midway, and in a span of just 5 minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers are sunk. And the next day, a 4th is also sunk. So it is a very quick, decisive victory for the United States, for the Americans. After Midway, the United States engages in a strategy of island hopping, taking back one island at a time, and capturing little Pacific islands in the hopes of getting close enough that we're within bombing range of Japan. The Japanese, however, are incredibly tenacious. And the problem that the Americans face is, unlike the Germans, the Japanese refuse to surrender. And I don't just mean on a national level, like the emperor refuses to surrender. The individual soldiers in these battles refuse to surrender too. The Japanese refuse to be taken as prisoners of war the same way that the Germans do. So many more Japanese are killed in these battles because they refuse to give up. So to give you an example of this, you have the Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945. So from the beginning, American victory was pretty much all but guaranteed at Iwo Jima. However, the battle lasts more than a month, despite the fact that the American Air Force controls the skies over the island. More than 18,000 Japanese soldiers are killed in combat. Ultimately, though, the United States does win, and you can see on the slide the famous picture of the American soldiers raising the flag on the island of Iwo Jima. And so given this kind of fierce resistance from the Japanese, the United States decides to take things to the next level. The United States begins firebombing the Japanese capital of Tokyo. We had started doing it regularly in 1944, but we ramp up things to a much larger scale with Operation Meeting House on March 9th and 10th of 1945. These are some of the deadliest raids in the Japanese capital. Japan, or rather Tokyo, is devastated in much the same way that Dresden is devastated by firebombing in the European theater. After Operation Meeting House, 25% of the city of Tokyo is destroyed. 100,000 Japanese are left dead. Millions, or rather a million more, are left homeless, I should say. But still, the Japanese government refuses to surrender. The fighting on the islands continues, and unfortunately it remains just as slow and as bloody as at Iwo Jima. Between April and June of 1945, for 82 days, the Americans fight to conquer the island of Okinawa. Okinawa is about 500 miles from the Japanese mainland, and once again, the Japanese fight to the death. The Japanese are so desperate at this point that they wind up drafting 1,800 middle school students to fight on the front line to Okinawa, which is just a shocking figure. This was also the peak period for the Japanese kamikaze attacks. These are suicide missions wherein the Japanese will fly their aircraft directly into United States battleships and carriers. These are our suicide missions. The Japanese used 1,465 kamikaze attacks at the Battle of Okinawa. And at the end of the day, 12,500 Americans died in the battle, 100,000 Japanese. So the United States continues to face increasing resistance by the Japanese, and the death toll continues to climb on both sides. And so it's at this point the United States decides that they need to do something drastic. They need to take an unprecedented action. And that unprecedented action is the use of the atomic bombs. No nation ever used an atomic bomb before this point. The United States is still the only country, and God willing, the last country ever to use an atomic bomb in combat. So the first atomic bomb is dropped on the city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. And the first atomic bomb is called the Little Boy, and it is dropped by the Enola Gay. The results of the bombing are devastating. Many people are instantly vaporized when the bomb hits, and all we are left with are these kind of burn marks, these kind of shadows of them. You can see these pictures on the bottom left-hand portion of the slide, that nothing was left of those people other than those kind of shadows. But somewhere between 90 and 160,000 people are killed in the bombing at Hiroshima. And again, this is just completely unprecedented. The building on the bottom right, the kind of burnt out dome there, that was the center of the blast where the bomb fell. Despite dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, the Japanese still refuse to surrender. The Japanese, for their part, are willing to consider that maybe this is a one-off, that sure, the United States dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, but can they really do anything like that again? But things will continue to get worse for the Japanese. On August 8th of 1945, the Soviet Union finally declares war on the Japanese as well. Russia had signed a non-aggression pact with the Japanese earlier, and they had stayed out of the war in Asia up until this point. The next day, on August 9th, the Americans dropped the second atomic bomb on the Japanese, the Fat Man. It's dropped on the city of Nagasaki, and somewhere between 60 and 80,000 people are killed. And as at Hiroshima, right, the destruction, both physical and in terms of human life, is simply massive. Finally, the Japanese surrender. The Japanese emperor announces that Japan will surrender on August 15th, 1945, and the Japanese officially signed their unconditional surrender on September 2nd, 1945. And so we consider either of these dates, August 15th or September 2nd, to be VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. And with that, the war is now over in both the Pacific and in Europe. So like I said, we'll see next week how the Europeans will attempt to put the pieces together after the war. But just as one more little postscript today, I just want to show you this picture of modern day Hiroshima. The building in the foreground there is the same building that was the epicenter of the first atomic blast. The Japanese call it the Genbatsu Dome, or Genbaku Dome, excuse me. And the Japanese have left this ruined dome standing here in Hiroshima, even as they've rebuilt the rest of the city. Today, it's kind of a memorial to the atomic bombs, and Hiroshima has become a big center of peace studies. And it's kind of meant to be a reminder to the world of the devastation of the horrors of nuclear war. You know, the two bombs that the United States dropped are the only atomic weapons that have ever been used in war. And, you know, God willing, we can learn from that, and there will never be any more of those. In any case, that's all I have for today. Like I said, we will talk about the origins of the Cold War next week, and we'll talk about how the Europeans start to put things back together. So thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a good break. Thanks.